Let's be honest, the forebrain is one of the most confusing topics in neuroanatomy. Students try to memorize dozens of structures: the cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, thalamus, internal capsule, limbic system, blood supply, and after a few days, everything gets mixed up. But what if I told you there's a much easier way? In this video, I'll teach you the entire forebrain using high-quality visual infographics, simple analogies, clinical cases, and USMLE high-yield concepts. By the end of this lecture, you'll understand where every structure is located, what each structure actually does, which artery supplies it, and most importantly, how examiners test it in USMLE, NEET PG, and FMGE. So don't try to memorize the brain. Understand it once, and you'll remember it forever. Let's begin. Before we learn individual structures, we need to answer one simple question. What exactly is the forebrain? Think of the brain as a country. The forebrain is its capital city, where thinking, memory, emotions, language, movement, and decision-making all happen. Once you understand this big picture, every structure will fall into place naturally.
Before we dive into the anatomy of the forebrain, I want you to forget all the complicated names you've heard: cerebral cortex, thalamus, basal ganglia, internal capsule. We'll get to those later. First, let's understand the big picture. Imagine that your body is a large hospital. Every hospital needs someone to coordinate thousands of activities happening at the same time. Doctors are treating patients, nurses are giving medications, security is protecting the building, pharmacists are preparing drugs, and the reception team is communicating with everyone. Who makes sure all these departments work together? The Chief Executive Officer, the CEO. The CEO doesn't perform every task personally. Instead, the CEO receives information, makes important decisions, coordinates different departments, and ensures that everything runs smoothly. Your forebrain works in exactly the same way. It is the CEO headquarters of the entire nervous system. Almost every higher function that makes us human is controlled here. It allows us to think, solve problems, and plan for the future. It gives us intelligence, helping us learn from experience and adapt to new situations. It stores our memories, so we can remember faces, names, and important events. It generates our emotions, shaping our behavior and personality. It controls our voluntary movements, allowing us to write, walk, speak, and perform precise hand movements. It processes sensory information, helping us feel touch, pain, temperature, and body position. It enables language, allowing us to understand speech and communicate our thoughts. It interprets vision, transforming light entering our eyes into meaningful images. And finally, it is responsible for decision-making, allowing us to weigh options, make choices, and interact intelligently with the world around us. In simple words, the forebrain is the command center of the human brain. Without it, you may still be alive, but you wouldn't be able to think, learn, remember, speak, plan, or truly function as a human being. Now that we understand why the forebrain is so important, let's explore where it is located and how it is organized. Now that we know the forebrain is the CEO headquarters of the nervous system, the next question is, where exactly is it located? Let's start with the big picture. Anatomically, the brain is divided into three major regions: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Think of these as three major divisions of one large organization. Among them, the forebrain is the largest and most highly developed part. In fact, it makes up nearly 80% of the entire brain, which explains why it is responsible for most of the functions that make us uniquely human. If we look at this diagram, you can see that the forebrain occupies the anterior or front portion of the brain, sitting just in front of the midbrain. This is why, in our hospital analogy, I call it the main office building, the place where the most important decisions are made. But the forebrain is not a single structure. It is actually divided into two major components. The first is the telencephalon. This is the largest part of the forebrain and includes the two cerebral hemispheres, the cerebral cortex, the basal ganglia, the hippocampus, and the olfactory bulbs. Whenever you think, speak, remember, solve problems, or perform voluntary movements, you're mainly using the telencephalon. The second component is the diencephalon. Although it is much smaller, it is equally important. It contains the thalamus, the brain's major relay station, the hypothalamus, which regulates body temperature, hunger, thirst, hormones, and the autonomic nervous system, along with the epithalamus and subthalamus, which also contribute to essential neurological functions. So remember this simple rule. Forebrain equals telencephalon plus diencephalon. If you remember this relationship, you've already mastered one of the most fundamental concepts in neuroanatomy. As we move forward, we'll explore each of these structures individually. Before we move any further, I want you to memorize one important fact. If you remember only one thing from today's lecture, let it be this. The forebrain has only two major parts. That's it. Not 5, not 10, only 2. Every structure we'll study later belongs to one of these two divisions. The first is the cerebrum. Think of the cerebrum as the largest and most visible part of the brain. It's the wrinkled structure that most people picture when they think of the brain. The cerebrum is responsible for the functions that define us as human beings. It allows us to think, learn, remember, solve problems, speak, understand language, make decisions, and perform voluntary movements. Inside the cerebrum, you'll also find important structures such as the cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, hippocampus, and olfactory bulbs. Now let's move to the second part, the diencephalon. Although it's much smaller and hidden deep within the brain, it is absolutely essential. The diencephalon contains the thalamus, which acts as the brain's major relay station, directing sensory information to the correct areas of the cerebral cortex. It also contains the hypothalamus, the body's master regulator. It controls body temperature, hunger, thirst, sleep, hormone secretion, and many autonomic functions that keep us alive. Along with these, it includes the epithalamus and subthalamus, each playing important roles in brain function. So whenever you see the word forebrain, your brain should immediately think, forebrain equals cerebrum plus diencephalon. This simple relationship is tested repeatedly in medical school and board examinations because it forms the foundation for understanding neuroanatomy. Once you know these two major divisions, learning the rest of the forebrain becomes much easier. Now we've reached the largest and most fascinating part of the forebrain, the cerebrum. In fact, when most people hear the word brain, they're actually thinking about the cerebrum. It is the large, folded structure that occupies most of the cranial cavity and is responsible for almost everything that makes us uniquely human. But instead of memorizing its parts, let's understand it using a simple analogy. Imagine the cerebrum as a modern city. A city functions efficiently because every department has a specific role. There are roads connecting different places, buildings where important work takes place, power stations supplying energy, and traffic control systems coordinating movement. The cerebrum works in exactly the same way. Let's explore this city one structure at a time. Roads. White matter. Every city needs roads to connect different areas. In the cerebrum, these roads are called the white matter. White matter is made up of millions of myelinated nerve fibers that rapidly carry information between different parts of the brain. Without these communication highways, different regions couldn't work together. Buildings. Cerebral cortex. Now think about the buildings. This is where people work, decisions are made, and important activities take place. In the cerebrum, these buildings represent the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the thin outer layer of grey matter where higher brain functions occur. This is where you think, learn, remember, solve problems, understand language, and make decisions. In simple words, the cortex is where intelligence lives. Power station. Basal ganglia. Every city also needs a power station to keep everything running smoothly. In the cerebrum, we can compare this to the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia don't create movement. Instead, they help start, smooth, and control voluntary movement. They make your actions precise and coordinated. Without the basal ganglia, movement becomes slow, rigid, or uncontrolled. as seen in disorders such as Parkinson's disease. Traffic police, 2 cerebral hemispheres. Finally, imagine traffic police directing vehicles and keeping the city organized. The cerebrum has 2 hemispheres, the right and the left. They constantly communicate through nerve fibers, allowing both sides of the brain to work as one coordinated system. Although each hemisphere has specialized functions, they cooperate continuously to produce smooth thought, movement, and behavior. Why the cerebrum is so important. When you read a book, recognize a friend's face, solve a mathematical problem, remember your childhood, speak a sentence, move your hand, or make an important life decision, you're using your cerebrum. This single structure is responsible for nearly all higher mental functions that define us as human beings. Cerebral cortex, where every thought begins. We've just learned that the cerebrum is the largest part of the forebrain. But here's something fascinating. The cerebrum itself has a command center, and that command center is called the cerebral cortex. If the cerebrum is a modern city, then the cerebral cortex is the corporate headquarters, where every important decision is made. Every idea, every memory, every word you speak, every movement you make, every dream you imagine, begins here. Where is the cortex? Let's first locate it. The cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the cerebrum. It forms the wrinkled surface that gives the human brain its characteristic appearance. This outer layer is made of grey matter, while just beneath it lies the white matter, which carries information to and from different parts of the brain. A simple way to remember this is, grey matter thinks, white matter connects. That's one of the highest yield facts in neuroanatomy. How can something so thin be so powerful? Now here's the amazing part. The cerebral cortex is only about 2 to 4 millimeters thick. That's thinner than the width of your little finger's nail. Yet within this incredibly thin layer are billions of neurons, all communicating with one another every second. Imagine fitting one of the world's largest companies into a sheet only a few millimeters thick. That's exactly what nature has accomplished with the cerebral cortex. Think back to our company analogy. Imagine walking into the headquarters of a multinational corporation. Hundreds of employees are analyzing information, making decisions, planning future projects, solving problems, and communicating with one another. The cerebral cortex works in exactly the same way. Every neuron is like an employee. Alone, one employee can do very little. But when billions work together, they create intelligence, learning, language, creativity, and consciousness itself. Because of this enormous network, the cortex performs the highest functions of the human brain. It allows us to think and solve problems. It stores and retrieves memories. It enables learning and intelligence. It allows us to understand and produce speech. It interprets what we see, hear, and feel. It controls voluntary movements, and it shapes our personality, behavior, and decision-making. In other words, the cerebral cortex is what transforms a living brain into a thinking human mind. Here are a few facts that every medical student should know. Although the cortex is only 2 to 4 millimeters thick, it contains billions of neurons. It is folded into countless ridges and grooves called gyri and sulci, allowing a much larger surface area to fit inside the skull. Despite representing only a small fraction of the brain's thickness, it consumes about 20% of the body's oxygen because its neurons are constantly active. Even while you're asleep, your cerebral cortex never completely shuts down. We've just learned that the cerebral cortex is where thinking happens. But here's an important question. How does one part of the brain communicate with another? The answer is white matter. White matter lies just beneath the cerebral cortex and is made up of millions of myelinated axons. Think of these axons as the highways of the brain. Just as highways connect different cities, white matter connects different parts of the brain, allowing information to travel quickly and efficiently. But here's the key concept that every medical student should remember. White matter does not think. It simply carries information. The thinking happens in the grey matter. The white matter is the communication network that delivers those messages. Imagine you decide to pick up a cup of coffee. The decision is made in the cerebral cortex. That signal then travels through the white matter, down the spinal cord, to the muscles of your arm, and finally, your muscles contract. Without white matter, the message would never reach its destination. Clinically, damage to white matter slows or blocks communication between different regions of the brain. This is why diseases such as multiple sclerosis, where myelin is damaged, cause weakness, numbness, poor coordination, and other neurological symptoms. So before we move on, remember this one high-yield rule. Grey matter thinks. White matter connects. If you remember that single sentence, you've already mastered one of the most tested concepts in neuroanatomy. Now let's look at one of the most misunderstood structures in neuroanatomy, the basal ganglia. Think of a busy city. Cars can move on their own, but without traffic police, every intersection would become chaotic. The traffic police don't drive the cars, they simply make sure traffic flows smoothly, safely, and efficiently. The basal ganglia work in exactly the same way. They do not initiate movement. Instead, they select the correct movement, suppress unwanted movements, and make every action smooth, coordinated, and automatic. Imagine writing your name, walking, typing on a keyboard, or smiling. You don't consciously think about every tiny muscle involved. That's because your basal ganglia are constantly fine-tuning those movements in the background. Anatomically, the basal ganglia are deep collections of grey matter located within the cerebral hemispheres. The major nuclei include the caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, subthalamic nucleus, and substantia nigra. Now let's connect this to the clinic. When the basal ganglia are damaged, movement becomes abnormal. In Parkinson's disease, loss of dopamine causes bradykinesia, muscle rigidity, resting tremor, and postural instability. The patient wants to move, but the movements become slow, stiff, and difficult. So remember this one high-yield rule. The cerebral cortex decides to move. The basal ganglia make that movement smooth. Think of the basal ganglia as the traffic police of the brain. They don't drive the car, but without them, movement becomes disorganized.